Power over nations is rarely decided by headlines or public statements. It is shaped quietly, through geography, resources, and long-term positioning. In this case, what appears to be a distant regional dispute is actually tied to deeper strategic calculations that most discussions avoid addressing directly. This video examines why the United States remains intensely focused on Venezuela, not as a sudden crisis, but as a calculated strategic priority. The idea of strategic control explains how influence, leverage, and pressure operate beyond military action, revealing why the commonly accepted explanation only tells part of the story. The analysis unfolds step by step, each reason building on the last. But it is the final factor that fundamentally reframes how this relationship should be understood, changing the way this conflict fits into the wider global power structure. By the end of this video, you'll understand why. Venezuela's importance begins beneath its soil. It holds one of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, but the significance is not volume alone. Much of this crude is heavy and difficult to refine, which ties it to specific infrastructure, specialized refineries, and long-term supply planning. Control over such resources is less about immediate profit and more about leverage over future energy security. For decades, energy access has shaped global influence. States that can restrict, redirect, or stabilize supply gain quiet power over markets and alliances. Venezuela's oil, if independently managed or aligned with rival powers, introduces uncertainty into that system. From a strategic perspective, unpredictability in energy flows is a liability the United States has historically worked to minimize. This is not about short-term shortages. It is about who sets the rules during moments of crisis. Oil reserves become political tools when global systems tighten, and Venezuela represents a variable that cannot be ignored. The question has never been whether the oil would be used as leverage, but by whom and under what conditions. At this stage, the stakes were still largely economic and structural, but energy alone does not explain the intensity of long-term pressure that followed. Because once geography enters the equation, the problem expands far beyond resources. Venezuela's position gives it strategic weight that exceeds its borders. It sits at the northern edge of South America, facing the Caribbean Sea, with direct access to maritime routes that connect North and South America to the Atlantic world. This location places it near critical shipping lanes that support trade, energy transport, and naval movement. For the United States, the Caribbean has long functioned as a security buffer. Stability in this region reduces risks close to its coastline and preserves freedom of movement for both commercial and military vessels. Any state with the ability to influence or disrupt that space gains disproportionate strategic relevance. Venezuela's coastline, ports, and airspace form part of this equation. Control or alignment here affects surveillance, logistics, and response time across a wide area. Even without active conflict, the presence of unfriendly influence introduces planning complications that militaries and policymakers are trained to avoid. Geography also shapes alliances. A strategically located state can act as a gateway for external powers seeking regional access. This transforms domestic instability into an international concern. From Washington's perspective, geographic uncertainty near core trade routes is not a distant problem, but a proximity risk. This is why pressure has extended beyond diplomacy. Location turns internal decisions into external consequences. What might otherwise remain a regional matter becomes a variable in global calculations once it touches shipping corridors and naval reach. At this point, the situation was still manageable through influence and deterrence. But geography creates opportunity not only for the United States, and it is the interest of other global powers that quietly altered the balance next. Venezuela's strategic value increased sharply once it became a point of entry for rival powers. As relations with the United States deteriorated, Caracas began expanding political, economic, and military ties with countries that openly challenged American global influence. This shift transformed Venezuela from a regional concern into a broader strategic liability. Russia, China, and Iran each approached Venezuela with different objectives, but the result was the same: deeper external involvement in the Western Hemisphere. Military cooperation agreements, arms transfers, intelligence collaboration, and infrastructure investment followed. None of these actions were isolated. They formed part of a pattern in which rival states sought access, leverage, and long-term positioning close to U.S. territory. From Washington's perspective, this crossed an unwritten boundary. The concern was not immediate military confrontation, but precedent. Allowing adversarial powers to establish sustained influence in a strategically located country risked normalizing a new balance of power in the region. History had shown that once such footholds solidify, reversing them becomes costly and uncertain. This is where strategic denial comes into play. Preventing rivals from gaining access can be as important as expanding one's own influence. Venezuela became a test case for whether the United States could still enforce limits within its traditional sphere of influence without direct military engagement. The issue was not simply ideology or diplomacy. It was infrastructure, access, and permanence. Ports, airspace cooperation, intelligence sharing, and financial systems create long-term dependencies that outlast individual governments. Once embedded, they reshape regional security calculations. At this stage, the conflict was no longer bilateral. Venezuela had become a node in a wider competition, linking local instability to global rivalry. The strategic cost of inaction increased with every new agreement signed and every external presence normalized. But blocking rival influence required more than pressure or containment. It demanded control over the systems that allowed such partnerships to function. And that struggle soon shifted from territory and alliances to something far more abstract, but equally powerful. Energy is not only a resource. It is a pricing system that shapes global stability. Venezuela's role within international oil markets gave it influence beyond production levels, particularly through its position inside OPEC and its ability to coordinate with other energy-producing states. This influence mattered even when output declined, because pricing power depends as much on alignment as on volume. For the United States, market predictability is strategic. Stable energy prices support economic planning, alliance cohesion, and domestic political balance. When producers operate outside accepted frameworks, they introduce volatility. Venezuela's willingness to challenge pricing norms, negotiate independently, or align with rival producers disrupted assumptions that had guided energy policy for decades. This disruption was not theoretical. Oil pricing affects inflation, currency stability, and industrial costs across multiple economies. A single actor, if coordinated with others, can amplify these effects. Venezuela's position allowed it to participate in collective decisions that could undermine market expectations at critical moments. Control in this context does not mean ownership. It means influence over behavior. Sanctions, access restrictions, and financial isolation were designed to limit Venezuela's ability to shape pricing outcomes and coordinate freely with alternative blocs. The objective was not immediate compliance, but long-term constraint. Energy markets operate on confidence. Once trust erodes, prices react sharply. From Washington's view, allowing an adversarial-aligned producer to retain pricing influence without restraint risked broader instability. The concern was not today's market, but tomorrow's crisis. This phase of pressure revealed a shift in strategy. The focus moved from physical assets to systemic influence. Markets became the battlefield and pricing the weapon. But economic pressure rarely exists in isolation. Because as financial constraints tightened, the conflict moved deeper into the political fabric of an entire region. Venezuela's role extended beyond economics and security. It functioned as a political reference point within Latin America, particularly for governments and movements seeking alternatives to U.S.-aligned systems. This symbolic influence amplified its strategic value. A single state, if seen as successfully resisting pressure, can reshape regional expectations. For Washington, this created a credibility problem. Influence in the Western Hemisphere has historically relied not only on force or trade, but on perception. If Venezuela's model appeared sustainable, it risked encouraging similar paths elsewhere. The concern was not ideological spread alone, but the erosion of deterrence. Political influence travels through narratives. Energy partnerships, financial aid, and diplomatic coordination allowed Venezuela to position itself as a counterweight within regional forums. This challenged long-standing U.S. efforts to maintain coherence among neighboring states on security, trade, and governance norms. The response was calibrated. Pressure increased through diplomatic isolation, sanctions coordination, and support for regional alignment against Caracas. The objective was containment, not transformation. Limiting Venezuela's ability to project influence mattered as much as addressing its internal trajectory. Latin America operates on relationships built over time. Disrupting one node affects the network. Venezuela's position meant that shifts in its alignment had ripple effects, altering how smaller states calculated risk and opportunity. This phase marked a widening of the conflict. What began as a bilateral tension now carried regional consequences. Each diplomatic move was evaluated not only for its direct effect, but for the signal it sent across borders. At this point, pressure had reached political, economic, and symbolic dimensions. Yet none of these tools fully resolved the problem, because influence alone does not guarantee compliance when security calculations begin to shift. Sanctions became the primary instrument once other forms of influence proved insufficient. They offered a way to apply sustained pressure without direct confrontation, targeting revenue streams, financial access, and institutional capacity. In the case of Venezuela, sanctions were not a single action, but a layered system designed to restrict movement across multiple economic channels. The logic was strategic rather than punitive. Limiting access to international banking, investment, and trade was intended to narrow options over time. Economic isolation increases dependency, weakens state capacity, and forces difficult internal trade-offs. From Washington's perspective, this created leverage without triggering open conflict. But sanctions also reshape behavior in unintended ways. As formal channels closed, Venezuela sought alternatives, turning to non-Western financial systems, informal trade networks, and barter arrangements. These adaptations reduced transparency and made outcomes harder to predict. Pressure produced resilience as much as constraint. This phase revealed a deeper challenge. Economic tools can damage structures, but they do not always alter strategic alignment. In some cases, they harden it. The longer sanctions remained in place, the more Venezuela's leadership adjusted to operating outside traditional systems, reducing the effectiveness of incremental pressure. Compliance, once assumed to be a natural endpoint, became uncertain. The cost of reversal increased as new dependencies formed. What began as leverage risked becoming permanent fragmentation. At this stage, the conflict entered a more rigid phase. Flexibility narrowed on both sides, and policy options began to close rather than expand. And when economic tools lose elasticity, attention inevitably shifts toward security and force calculations. As economic pressure reached its limits, security considerations moved closer to the center of strategy. Venezuela's military capabilities, while not globally dominant, carried regional significance. Investments in air defense systems, aircraft, and radar coverage altered the local balance and attracted heightened scrutiny from U.S. planners. The concern was not an immediate threat, but potential. Military systems shape options long before they are used. Enhanced surveillance, airspace control, and coastal defense complicate response scenarios and expand strategic depth. For the United States, uncertainty near key maritime routes and regional partners introduced risks that required contingency planning. Foreign involvement amplified these concerns. Training missions, technical support, and equipment maintenance from external powers increased the durability of Venezuela's capabilities. This created the perception of permanence rather than experimentation. Security relationships, once established, are difficult to unwind without escalation. Military posture also carries symbolic weight. It signals intent, resilience, and alignment. Even defensive systems can be interpreted as political statements when deployed in contested contexts. Each upgrade recalibrated expectations and reduced the margin for miscalculation. This phase did not lead to open conflict, but it reshaped planning. Exercises, intelligence collection, and regional coordination intensified. The objective was preparedness, not provocation. At this point, the conflict had touched nearly every domain: economic, political, and military. Yet an even more foundational system was now implicated, one that underpins global power itself. Because when finance enters the equation, influence becomes systemic rather than situational. Beyond military balance and regional influence lies a quieter foundation of global power: the financial system. For decades, energy trade has been closely tied to the US dollar, reinforcing its role as the world's primary reserve currency. This linkage grants the United States an extraordinary form of influence, allowing it to shape transactions, enforce rules, and monitor flows across borders. Venezuela's attempts to bypass dollar-based systems challenged this structure. Efforts to trade oil using alternative currencies, barter arrangements, or non-Western financial channels were not just economic adaptations. They represented a shift away from a system that underwrites American leverage. Even limited success in these efforts raised concerns far beyond Venezuela itself. The issue was precedent. If one energy producer could operate outside dollar frameworks without consequence, others might follow. Over time, this would weaken the coherence of a system that depends on widespread participation. Financial influence, unlike military power, erodes gradually and often invisibly. From Washington's perspective, allowing such erosion carried long-term risks. Control over financial infrastructure enables sanctions, deterrence, and crisis management. Losing that control reduces options across all domains. Venezuela's experimentation with alternatives therefore mattered less for immediate impact and more for what it signaled about future alignment. This phase of the conflict revealed its deepest layer. The struggle was no longer about territory or resources, but about rules. Who sets them, who follows them, and who can afford to ignore them? At this point, the conflict had reached into the core systems of global order. But the pressure did not originate only from abroad. Internal dynamics inside the United States now began to shape the trajectory as well. Foreign policy is often presented as a response to external threats, but it is equally shaped by internal pressures. Venezuela became entangled in domestic U.S. politics in ways that extended beyond strategy alone. Energy markets, migration concerns, institutional interests, and regional alliances all fed into how policy hardened over time. Energy remains a domestic issue. Fluctuations in oil supply and pricing affect inflation, employment, and political stability inside the United States. Venezuela's position as a major energy holder meant that its alignment had downstream effects on domestic calculations. Even when imports declined, the symbolic and structural role of Venezuelan oil continued to matter. Migration added another layer. Economic collapse and instability in Venezuela contributed to regional displacement, placing pressure on neighboring states and indirectly on U.S. borders. Over time, what began as a foreign crisis entered domestic political discourse, reinforcing calls for decisive policy and reducing tolerance for ambiguity. Institutions also play a role. Once a policy framework is established, bureaucratic momentum sustains it. Sanctions regimes, intelligence assessments, and alliance commitments create continuity across administrations. Venezuela became embedded in these systems, making reversal politically and institutionally costly. This internal alignment produced consistency rather than resolution. Pressure persisted not because it succeeded, but because altering course carried its own risks. The conflict became self-reinforcing, shaped as much by domestic stability concerns as by external strategy. By this stage, Venezuela was no longer just a foreign issue. It had become part of the internal machinery of U.S. power. And when domestic logic aligns with external strategy, the outcome extends far beyond any single country. At its deepest level, the conflict between the United States and Venezuela is not about a single policy failure, leader, or crisis. It is about order. For more than a century, the Western Hemisphere has been treated as a strategic space where external influence is limited, and stability is enforced through a combination of power, norms, and precedent. This framework has adapted over time, but it has never disappeared. Venezuela challenged that framework by resisting alignment while occupying a position of real strategic weight. Its resources, geography, and partnerships made it impossible to ignore. Allowing a state with those attributes to operate outside established systems would have signaled a shift in hemispheric balance, not only to rivals, but to allies as well. Hegemony functions quietly. It depends on predictability, not constant enforcement. Once unpredictability spreads, it forces response. Venezuela became a point where multiple lines intersected. Energy independence, regional influence, rival access, financial rules, and domestic credibility. No single factor explains the pressure applied. Together, they made disengagement impossible. This is why the conflict persisted even as conditions changed. Strategies adjusted, rhetoric evolved, but the underlying objective remained stable. Control did not mean occupation or conquest. It meant ensuring that the broader system remained intact, and that deviation carried costs. In this sense, Venezuela was never just Venezuela. It was a test of whether long-standing power structures could still absorb resistance without fragmenting. The outcome mattered less for immediate resolution than for what it demonstrated about the durability of global order. What appears as a prolonged standoff is, in reality, a slow structural confrontation, one that reveals how modern power is maintained, not through dramatic events, but through sustained pressure, constrained choices, and the quiet enforcement of limits.